Just like to say thanks to all people in INDEP for inviting me here to talk as a part of INDEP's and Metaphorum's online talk series for Stafford's beer, Centennial. Okay, so the name of the talk today is just quite simple, variety and planning. Okay, so uh, variety is like such a foundational kind of concept, and what are the implications of variety for planning and democratic socialist society? Okay, so this is I'm the host of this podcast going a long time now. I think it's going 14 years. Not so productive lately when I'm trying to write this book, that this talk is based on the research for the book. The website for the book here is the classlesssocietyinmotion.com. That's not going to be the name of the book. Don't have a designated name yet, but it's generally been highly influenced by um, Beer's work in cybernetics and also Marx and the fundamental principles and all that good stuff about uh, what can we say scientifically about the nature of a socialist society. Okay, so we're going to start here. I know this is beer. We're starting socially recognizing beer, but I thought we'd start off instead with a bit of Ashby. So Ashby, like if when you read Beer's work, it's always Ashby he goes to. It's always Ashby he's talking about. And Ashby introduced this like the basic concept of variety. It's a very simple concept, not difficult to get your head around, but it's got very, very profound implications. Okay, so what is variety? Here's one that there's loads of definitions of variety. Here's one that I think Donal wrote this one. So Donal, I'm going to blame you if it's wrong. Variety is a measure of the complexity of a system, the number of distinct states that a system can have. Okay, it's a pretty simple thing. If you have a chessboard, how many different valid chessboard arrangements can you have with the pieces? Okay. And with variety of this kind of secondary linked concept of requisite variety. Okay, so for a system to survive, it must have the ability to absorb the variety or chaos of its environment, make sense of it, and be able to respond in an appropriate manner. Okay, so if I am, an organism, a human in the world, I must have enough variety such that I can navigate my environment and survive and reproduce. Okay. So here's like a simple kind of a controller here. We have a thermostat in a room, which is able to basically control the temperature in the room. It's able to read in what the temperature is outside and is able, if the temperature goes too high, it's able to turn itself off. So it's able to control the temperature in the room. So cybernetics is often, talk of the science of control. Okay. Now, we're going to get onto some beer here now. So this is beer's, this is a visual description of beer's VSM model. So it's viable systems model. And this is basically based on implications of Ashby's law of requisite variety. Like, what are the necessary elements of a complex system if it's going to be able to like dissipate all the complexity in its environment and maintain itself, attenuate the variety in its environment and maintain itself as a system? So um, we see it's broken up into these like one, two, three, four, and five systems. So we have this kind of automatic operations. We can term it as the automatic part of the system, and then we have like this kind of conscious part of the system. Okay, we see up here like policy development and delivery, sometimes called executive planning, day-to-day management, and we have our operations down here one, and we have our communication system or coordination two, and we have our environment over here that we interact with. Our system is interacting within its environment. Okay. Now, this was first laid out in in 1972's Brain of the Firm, Beer's Brain of the Firm. It's a really, really great read. Heavy emphasis on like its inspiration from biology. And of course it gets into, which we'll talk about later, it gets into some of Beer's experience, second half of the book, on what happened in Chile with the CyberSyn project. And it's also like from a 79 book, The Heart of the Enterprise, which doesn't get as much um, kind of kudos, I think, as Brain of the Firm. But I actually think it's like a kind of an easier read for somebody. He builds up the VSM from kind of first principles. I bought it. I bought it. Is this the copy I bought, or is this a? I don't know if this is an internet picture. I bought a copy of this on I think $8 or whatever. And it turns out when I got it and I opened it up, it's a hardback one from the 70s. It was signed by Beer, and it was signed, and I think it was actually signed to his business partner who he set up his management consultancy in the 60s or whatever. So that was kind of a bit of a shock, but that was kind of cool. But anyway, just thought people might like that. So another concept that kind of relates to like that comes out of this idea of variety and Rex variety and the VSM is this idea of recursion. Okay. So this is the idea of kind of, self-similar systems stacked, nested hierarchy of self-similar systems. Okay. And, this kind of great chain of being. We have, I mean, in Ireland, we've got the Irish government, we've got local government. Then you'd say we got my town, we got me, my family, we got me, we got my lungs, and all the way down, we got blood cells, all the way. We've got these systems, right? And they have similar structures that are necessary to allow the kind of large structures to survive within their environment. Okay. And this is direct implication of Ashby's law of requisite variety. Okay. Now, if we look at this, the we see these say four recursions here. That recursions they rely on controlling the lower system, and that system controlling the lower system, and so on and so forth. Okay. And if we want to think about how this might operate, if we think about, say, a football team, we've got a football team. Now, a manager can give players general instructions about maybe what type of defensive formation or attacking strategies to take. But only the player on the pitch can like judge the flight of the ball and chest it down and so on. So like the manager will try and control the player through to control what the player does, right? But he won't be able to directly do it because he will not have the requisite variety to do that. Okay? And the manager itself might be controlled by the higher recursion. Okay, say maybe the owners of Man United here. Okay, and so they will try and control the manager, and the manager will try and control the players. And this is how these large systems manage to survive and to control themselves in their environment. Okay, that this idea of recursion comes out of the very basis of the complexity of nature. Okay. So that's a kind of a very quick run through the kind of guts of variety and the VSM. So now we're going to switch now to the labor process. Okay. And we're going to have a look at how variety has played a role in the historical development of say capitalist production methods. Okay. So if we go back to the early capitalist production, we see that the organization of work was actually largely managed by the workers themselves. It's kind of counterintuitive. You had this idea, yeah, in my head, I had this thinking that it was all very much, hyper controlled. But actually, the workers were generally left to do their thing along with the foreman. Obviously they were still exploited or whatever, but they had quite a lot of control over the production process. Okay. Now, with the rise here, this is Frederick Taylor. Okay. And he's like kind of a big influence. He came up as a part of this efficiency movement that was rising in like Britain and America at the time, the late 1800s, which was trying to identify and eliminate waste in the economy and society more generally, and trying to drive and develop, best practices in production. Okay, so Taylor, like if you read his work, this kind of famous experiment, this pig iron experiment, where these poor unfortunate lads here were lifting these big lumps of pig iron. They would lift them basically from I think if I remember correctly, not always the case, but like from a trailer, they might on a train track, and then they would walk them over to another place, maybe 20 yards, and just all day just shifting these big, like heavy blobs, ingots of kind of not fully yet processed steel, I think. Iron, pig iron, of course. And so Taylor was studying these guys and he was trying to see if he could get them to do their work more efficiently. Okay. And so he would monitor like all the movements they did, whether they should lift it in a certain way using their legs or their knees, how long a step they should be, where they should position themselves, and how long of a break should they take to maximize their output. All of these kind of things. Okay. And also, part of all this is this. We supposed to Taylor. This is Taylor's kind of acolytes. This is Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. They brought in these ideas of motion studies, which were like they would analyze with film exactly what workers were doing, and then try and study and see if they could come up with a better process. So, Beer in Brain of the Firm, he actually talks about meeting, I think. I'm not sure if it was Frank Gilbreth. He might have been dead at the time, but certainly Lilial Gilbreth. So Beer was like a big fan of these time and motion studies, which we'll see is kind of interesting. But okay, so there was kind of two elements to this. The first element was this idea of kind of like standardization. Okay, so this was like say the pig iron experiment, for example, like lots of guys might have had very random different ways of doing production, right? They might have had many ways of lifting the pig iron and doing it. And across all of these different types of jobs, one big thing was standardization. They wanted to make production more predictable. Okay. So by standardizing the results, this would really help organization production. Two was optimization. Okay, so this was not just standardization, but actually, optimizing the techniques, finding that best method for lifting pig iron so that you could lift, you know, I think in this study, I can't remember the exact details, but I think it was like, 400% increase in productivity or 300% increase in productivity. Okay, where I think they used to lift a certain amount of tons a day, and then it was like if it was 15 tons a day, then it was like 67 tons a day. Okay, by using these new techniques. Okay, so this is kind of the same basis as kind of modern process control today. So this is if we think of like Lean Six Sigma, okay, Lean to optimize, Sigma to get rid of variation within the process. Okay. Now, a big element of what Taylor was trying to do as well was to actually break up the camaraderie of the workers. He would design the work process so that people would be too far apart to talk while they worked so that they could break the kind of the power of the workers as a collective versus management. So there was always within Taylor a big class warfare element. Right. And we see then in Taylor, like Marx talks about like, the worker being like the appendage of the machine. But Taylor brought this to a much higher level. Like it wasn't that the worker was merely a appendage of the machine. The worker themselves was transformed into a programmed machine, a machine that was programmed by management. They're very, repetitive studies, or sorry, the repetitive motions, was like they were programmed by management. Okay. And it wasn't just that the workers were like, you know, just they turned into the machine, but they were also like divorced from any type of holistic understanding of production. You frequently find like when the workers were in control, certainly like say if you look back to the mining in the UK and prior to the introduction of mechanization, that the workers would work within groups and they would all share the roles and people would have a full understanding of the work process. Well, this was very much stripped. Right, so this is a much more alienating form of work that was developed under Taylorism. Okay. And it wasn't just that it was like alienating and trying to break the work, the camaraderie within the work and take away the holistic experience of the work, but it was also a massive increase in the exploitation of labor. So we in under Taylorism we had workers increasing their productivity. Typically, you read all of Taylor's work at the time. It was a standard kind of a rule of thumb might be a 300% raise in productivity. And for this uh, 300% raise in productivity, the workers would get a 60% pay rise. Okay. So that was a massive increase in the amount of profits for the owners. The workers didn't get a 300% increase in their pay. Okay. They got a 60% and the rest was pocketed by the owners. And Taylor himself was always a deep class warrior. He talks about how, he was so unpopular with some of the workers that they threatened to kill him and throw him in a ditch on the way home. There's lots of this stuff in there. And much of his writing is about how you can break unions. Yeah. So deeply anti-worker power. Okay. Um, okay. What's next? Okay. Yes. So, but if we were to sit and analyze Taylorism, it relied on this separation of brain work and physical work. Okay, so we look at the diagram here. We have management were directly planning the operation, what the workers would do directly. They would give detailed instructions. The workers would execute them. There'll be a feedback, like a measurement, and management would optimize the work process again, 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 again. Okay, and so this was actually quite a cybernetically viable form of management, right? Because it had here, if we look at this, we have the management, this is basically like our conscious management part of the VSM, and then on the worker side, we have like our system ones, our conscious and our automatic. And this was like it combined into a single kind of coercive mechanism. Engineers provided the planning and executive control of production and foremen supply the automatic control, right, ensuring the day-to-day compliance of the workers to management's dictates, right? But as well, on a fundamental level, if we think then again to like Oshby's law, by taking the kind of self-organization element of production and stripping that element out and putting it into the management, okay, like this necessitated that the work this could only be done with very simplified work tasks, right? That the management would not have the requisite variety to plan like anything beyond very simple repetitive tasks. Okay. Um, so it expanded the regulatory role of management and it diminished that of labor. But by simplifying the labor process, it kind of conformed to Ashby's law. Okay. Now, if you think about, say, something like computer programming or something, the idea that, like, which is like, that you could have your manager dictate to you what keys to press to write a JavaScript web application or something would be completely absurd, right? And so they would rely on the actual the requisite variety. The only person with the requisite variety would be the programmer and not the manager. Okay, so we see that the way how Taylorism was implemented could only be implemented in certain uh, types of work. Okay. Um, so here's a picture of, I think, a strawberry. So if you put strawberry into isopropyl 90, it strips the cell membranes and it leaves the DNA intact. So what we're seeing here, this like blob is like a blob of DNA. Okay, just sitting there, extracted, and the pink at the bottom is the goo. So in some sense, what Taylorism did is they did this. They stripped, all of the kind of complexity from the labor process for it to work. Now, we might ask, was that necessary? Like, did Taylorism need to to was it necessary that Taylorism had to do this to optimize production? Okay, and we'd say, well, fundamentally, yes, because these production techniques and stuff, they exist within social relations of production. Okay. Now, the class nature of capitalist society meant that workers were never incentivized to improve the work process. Like, why would a worker improve their productivity if, like, the boss would steal all the benefits, right? Uh, typically what would happen, Taylor goes in explicitly into this stuff, where, any increase of intensity would just become the new norm. All the workers would say, why would we work like faster or do good production if this will become the new norm, and then our wages will stay the same, and then we're just producing twice as much for other people, for the bosses. Okay. So, and Taylor was well aware of this. Like, so he made an argument for like why the wage increases that they get should be permanent, so that if workers took on doing Taylorist, if they implemented Taylorism in a factory, that the workers would get a permanent 60% increase or whatever. Depends on the type of work. Sometimes it was 30%, sometimes it was 60%. And he was all very, very explicit in that we shouldn't pay workers too much because they don't know how to spend it, or they get uppity, all of these type of things in there. Okay, but so because of the class relation, we see that this increase in the productivity work took a kind of an antagonistic form. Okay, okay. Now, this idea of stripping variety out of the process met its zenith in with the Model T, with Ford's production. Ford was producing these cars. I think this is one of the Model Ts here, and the tagline that Ford was supposed to have said was, "It's available in any color so long as it was black." Yeah. So they literally only produced one color, which was black. They produced like, many, many millions of these. I think it's over 10 million of these cars in the 1920s. It's a lot of automobiles. Um, now these relied on, they stripped total like variety out of the production process. There was only one type of wheel, one type of steering wheel, one type of door, one type of chassis. Very, very simple. One color. Okay, so they applied economies of scale, and producing at vast quantities, and the kind of assembly line, so the flow of assembly line production. Okay, so this was like a great leap forward in capitalist production. Uh, the factories themselves, they were based on expensive single purpose machines. And workers were doing very simple, repetitive Taylor's type tasks. Okay, so but it was pretty simple to do. You just had to keep producing everything to feed that assembly line, right? If you're creating chassis, you just turn these chassis out as fast as you need to just keep the assembly line flowing. Okay. But like, nature kind of absorbs a vacuum, and this lack of variety would not last. Okay, yeah. One thing I forgot to mention is like Ford himself was a big time fan of Adolf Hitler, and it's alleged. I'm not sure if it's true that he funded the first translation of Mein Kampf into English. Just interesting tidbit. Here's Sloan. He was the head of GM, and he came in and he said, "Look, the Ford model, it's great and all that, but they've got an obvious weakness. They're only producing one type of car. Why don't we like use, say, one chassis, and then we could like exploit their lack of variety, and maybe just use different trimmings and stuff around this one basic kind of block of the car." Okay. And Sloan himself was also a Nazi collaborator. GM produced huge amounts of war equipment for the German war machine during World War II. So the kind of rule of thumb here is, scratch an American car manufacturer and you'll get yourself a nice fascist. Yeah. Okay. So uh, here's like an example of some of the what GM started producing. They did Cadillac, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick. So they use retoolable machines, right, to produce different kind of finishes on these different trim options to give customers greater variety. Okay. And these all relied on standardized components. A single engine block could be shared across models. And so by doing this, they basically ate Ford's lunch. The days of the single model was ended, right? And so he distributed and decentralized production like across the country. This is this is not of the time. This is a more this is GM's in the last few years. I don't know what year it's from, but they had production units across the country doing different models of cars. And also different parts, maybe engine blocks in one place and chassis in another part of the country. So with this gave birth to like what's termed as batch and queue production. Okay. Now, before when Ford was doing production, the production was basically, it was they were just producing those one machines. It was quite simple. Say if you're the manager of the chassis production thing. You just kept on producing chassis. You just knew you needed to produce enough to keep that assembly line ticking over, right? And it's quite basic, right? But now that they were wanting to do many models, uh, this ran into a lot of complexity because uh, the change over time, so say if you're producing one engine block and then you wanted to produce a different engine block, the changeover from these machines to change from one end type engine block to the next type engine block, this would typically be quite a long and arduous process, and there would be a lot of downtime. So instead of like producing in small batches, they would produce large batches to make sure that the machine utilization was as high as possible. Because like capitalists are always worried that like a new machine will come out that's better than this machine and that I will have to scrap this machine. So there's always pressure on them to utilize the machine as much as possible. Uh, as soon as possible, wear out that machine as fast as you can, and producing large batches was the way that this would need to be done. But by doing this, it increased huge kind of schedule, complexity in how to schedule all this. You know, um, production was vastly more production became a vastly more complicated process to govern. Okay, so if we think about it, the variety increase in the production, well, like became mirrored, just as you would expect by Ashby's law, mirrored in like the complexity of the controller had to increase, right, to reflect the complexity, the increased complexity in production. Okay, this is as like a kind of a matter of scientific necessity. Okay, and to actually manage all of this in a kind of a Taylorist way, right? That the management would the management would try and like do everything to give detailed instruction process about everything was like completely unrealistic. It would be like a cure that would kill the host in costs. So they needed some way, like GM, really quickly realized that they needed some way how to maintain like corporate control without sacrificing local autonomy. Okay. And so what they did is they gave birth to kind of modern budget management. So Sloan realized that GM, they didn't really need to directly manage the complexity of production directly, like the nitty-gritty, like the center didn't need to know about the nuts and bolts of production, this type of machine, that type of machine, all that. It only needed to manage the managers, just like we saw earlier with like, the footballer and the manager and blah, blah, blah. So this was like an idea of recursive control. Okay. And under this new arrangement, each individual division would retain its operational freedom on the condition that it would translate like the chaotic nature of their production process into a few like crisp columns, budgets, expenses, targets and output. So these would usually high just monetary items. Okay. So this was trying to get towards this idea of cybernetic control. Okay, system of like recursions with feedback, algorithmic feedback going up through the loops. So this is layered circuits of command and feedback designed to maintain control of the organization. But what was the problem? Okay, now Taylorism was based on this idea of like the one best way that the management could optimize that production process not these stupid workers out here lumping pig iron every half-assed way. We're going to come in there with our engineers and we're going to show and we're going to discover that best process. So we're going to give it down. So it gave a one best way. Okay. But GM was an expectation without guidance. Okay, so the higher recursions, they didn't know the nature of the work below them, but they would give what would amount to arbitrary targets, like increase sales by 3% or whatever. Whereas prior to that, the entailers and they were given really precise instructions. Now they were only able to do that because the simplified nature of the work. And here we see that the more complex nature of the work of these higher management roles, they were unable to give correct guidance on these because they were too complex a task. Like the computer programmer and his manager, it's too complex a task to give detailed instructions. So what was happening here? They were giving expectation without kind of guidance. So it was a perverse form of control, right? Where production wasn't optimized for efficiency, but it was optimized for meeting the dictates of a blind hierarchy. So, in essence, this is The Blind Leading the Blind by Peter Bruegel the Elder from 1568. In essence, you had this idea of like the blind leading the blind. The people at the top could not know what it was for the recursion below them to do their work properly. They did not have the requisite variety, and so on. So we had these arbitrary types of control. Okay, and we find that it wasn't optimized to do with production, like Taylor was optimized to do with the use value that they were producing. This was optimized to do with like a monetary value. So the emphasis was on a monetary value, which is quite, it's not surprising in capitalism that it would be the emphasis was on value as opposed to use value. Okay. Now, if we kind of think of what that would mean, right? It was kind of as if management were trying to control a car, say, by setting a target speed, right? Let's say I'm trying to control this car by setting a target speed, and I don't know anything about the bends in the roads, right? I don't have any knowledge of like what the weather conditions were. Was there engine overheating? What was the state of the tires? Was there like competitors' car positions here, in a race car? So the controller like lacked the requisite variety, and Ashby's law, just rearing his head again. So the actual utility of the machine, the capabilities of the workforce, the efficiency of the process, the tangible questions of how and why, like these were not to be found in the monthly report. Okay. We had this at a very deep level, we had got this separation between decision making and work, right? So this is inherent to control from above, and this has became enshrined as kind of like doctrine, it's still dominant today, overwhelmingly dominant today in 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 the capitalist production. Um, so you know to the extent, that in GM, like Sloan, he actually like saying like he said that of like people getting mixed up in the nitty-gritty of operations was like inappropriate, for a corporate executive. You should just literally not pay attention to the use value of production, but purely these value-based metrics, you know. And John Seddon, the British management consultant, always emphasizes this importance that like if you don't look at production from end to end, you get these individual elements uh, optimizing at the expense of the whole. So under Sloan, each individual recursion would optimize based on their targets, and they like would not care if it meant the firm would go bust. Essentially, once they get their bonus, obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration, but so that by giving targets in this way, we have people doing this kind of individual optimization, which always seems to produce less efficient overall optimization. So the overall efficiency of the process suffers. ironically by optimizing the individual elements. Okay, so I suppose the next big breakthrough in capitalist production methods came by this dude here, Taiichi Ono. This was the Toyota production system. Okay, like in when this is in the origins of this are in like post World War II, and Toyota were a very small car manufacturer. They were producing, I think, it's hard to know exactly, but of an order of like three to five, 6,000 cars a year. This is in like 1945, 46, versus the millions that were pumping out off the lines in Detroit. Now, so they didn't have the scale. And they also, in the ruins of post-war Japan, they did not have the capital to build the factories to compete with the Americans. So if they were to survive, they had to find some other way of doing it. And so they went to study American car producers in post-war Germany or post-war America, American car manufacturers, and what they saw basically when they went there was uh, basically inventories piling up everywhere, and this was basically the implications of batch and queue. By trying to make huge batches to keep your utilization of your machines high, what you ended up with all this massive secondary cost of large inventory sitting in warehouses. And in these inventories, you could, because you had such large inventories, if there was some dodgy component, you didn't really care about it and you could just chuck it out and pick another one out of the inventory and away you go. So we found it was actually what was a vast improvement over the prior stage of capitalist production actually was spewing out huge amounts of waste. Now, Ono, and I think also one of the Toyota family members who they were very inspired by the supermarket, the American supermarket at the time. You know, here a customer would like choose a product and they take the product off the shelf. Soon enough another worker would come along and they'd restock that shelf. Okay, so they looked at the supermarket and they were like, what if we just instead of doing batch and queue and these massive inventories everywhere, what if we try to only produce to the demand signal, right? And eliminate the need for these inventories everywhere. What if we only produced like as if, like in the supermarket, when they pull it off the shelf and then we'll create a new car to go back on that shelf? Okay, this is the general idea. So this is the difference between push and pull production. Now, capitalism has, you know, typically it's always been a push production system. Owners are always under pressure to maximize the utilization of the machines, in case they become obsolete by a competitor's innovation, right? And so output is maximized. This individual output of maximization is always attempted. And if there's too much demand, if there's too much production for demand, well, we can offload the product later. We'll worry about that. We could use a sale or something to get rid of it. We use discounts, right? Now, the TPS, they envisage a complete reorganization of production, right? They believe that small batch production could be more competitive if they manage to eliminate the waste, right? Endemic to push production. So each step in pulp production in the process was the cusp or the next. So it wasn't just that the final thing was demand, like the customer goes in and they buy a car, and then we push something out. It's that would trigger at each stage in the production process a demand signal to the next one. So everything is all these tightly aligned systems connected via algorithmic signals, pain pleasure signals. I've got too much, I don't have enough. I want more, I've got enough. Constantly going along and self-organization of production. Okay. Now, and it's at a very basic level, it's based, the TPS is based on or push production more generally, that optimizing individual steps is typically dysfunctional for the system as a whole. So take the concept of, rowers in a boat. They all have to row to a rhythm. If each individual each individual athlete here rows to their own personal maximum, the actual stroke will interfere with their neighbor strokes, and the boat will actually slow down, probably go crooked, do all manner of things. So they actually reorganize production, TPS did, to maintain, like, you want to basically work at the highest, everybody work to the speed of the lowest element. Okay, that's how you maximize your production. Okay. Now, this required what like myself and Donal like to call a social relations bubble to work. So if they were actually to try and work with no inventories, you see, this would be extremely difficult, right? And it would actually require using the full ingenuity of the workers on the line to optimize production, right? It's much more difficult to work with small inventories. If something goes wrong, perhaps you run out of stock, you can't produce, and then the whole line slows down. Okay? So Taylorism was based upon like optimizing the individual, right? If I am working and I'm lifting pig iron, if I come up with some, it's not just Taylorism, but usually most capitalist firms or whatever, is like I have an incentive to hoard my technique. If I can produce more and I can get paid more, why will I tell my workers? Everybody will just be doing the same thing, and then my wages will probably go down. So, um, if TPS was to succeed, it would need to be able to like standardize improvements across the firm. It's going to trying to compete with scale. If small batches to compete with scale, and this required, like to do this required that they would be standardizing improvements would need to eliminate individual bonuses based on production, right? And so what they did is they replaced it with equal wages on production lines, so that all the workers wouldn't be disincentivized to tell their other workers, "Oh, look, I found this new good way of doing it." And also, it wasn't just that, but they also gave them a job guarantee. Like, why would you tell a boss about an innovation that was going to get rid of the need for your own job? Okay. So what we ended up seeing here is this like massive putting of variety back into the line, right? Where Taylorism and like Fordism based on Taylorism had stripped variety out of the production line. How did Toyota go to manage to try and compete? By pushing variety back down the line. Okay, seems somewhat kind of contradictory, right? But now the workers, you see, we're doing Kaizen meetings. These are like standard meetings. Production was organized by the producers. It reduced their alienation, still fairly alienated labor, but it was less alienated than before, right? And productivity increased, you know, by about an order of magnitude is the general expectation. Somewhere like 5 to 10 times pull production is more efficient than push production. Okay. Now, here we see they also use kind of algorithmics. They have this in the Toyota production line, they have this and-on signal. So this is like if something is going wrong on the production line, they pull the cord and workers will try and solve the problem that has arisen. They may get help from experts, from engineers, from higher management if needed. So like, whereas in working for Ford and GM and all these, where stopping the production line was like a thing that would end up with managers being fired because your utilization of machines is going down. In Toyota, stopping the line was seen as a way to optimize production on a higher level. Okay. Now, capitalism in general has it kind of is everybody just doing TPS? Is everybody just going to, oh yeah, why not copy what Toyota do? They were a very small, like they probably had I would expect something like probably less than 1% of 1% of the global market in 1944. And today they are by far and away the biggest producer of the statistics I looked at. Maybe some Chinese car manufacturer is starting to take over. But last time I checked, they were very far and away the biggest manufacturer in the world. At the time of writing, say the famous book on the Toyota system for the West is Jeffrey Liker's book, The Toyota Way. I think they were like number two in the world. That was like 99. If you look now, they're like by far and away they were by far and away the biggest anyway. Last time I looked, like twice the size of the nearest American competitor or the German. I think it's either Volkswagen or GM is number two, right? And their profitability is extremely high. But capitalism has not generalized Toyota production style production. Okay. What we see is that it actually only emerges in like exceptional circumstances, right? And it requires long-term organizational equipment or commitment. Uh, why invest like in why if you're a capitalist manager or a capitalist boss or whatever, why would you invest all this like time and effort and money into having a workforce or an organize having the workforce themselves take control of production, right? Having this, in putting in this, very cybernetic production process, optimal, this amazing production process. Why would you do it if that machine that's going to replace the need for those workers are always just, over the horizon? Okay, so this is like a contradiction built into the social relations of capitalist production. That like, it is not easy to do what the TPS does. It takes organizational commitment. And capitalist bosses, unless you have a full commitment from all of higher management and a long-term commitment, you will probably fail trying to implement it. Okay. And so this is like a tension. It's not to do with this tension is built into the social relations of production, right? That there are capitalists who want to utilize the machines more fully, and that the worker, they're always trying to replace the worker. Taiichi Ono, like he goes on about like how Toyota were always slow to adopt new technology, right? That they would find that it was much more efficient to optimize the labor process before you try, instead of trying to just replace the try to automate away the worker's job. Okay. So this here we see that this social relation is actually a fetter, talking in Marxist terms now, it's a fetter on the mode of production, right? That um the way that the owner worker class relation is built in there actually means that the companies by far and away are less optimized, that the work is more alienated, right? It's more Taylorist, it's more push than it would should be, right? And the reason for that is the class relations underpinning it. So this is like for a socialist, this is like this would be an amazingly big thing for us. Where like in a socialist society, you would not have that like deleterious class relation, which would be preventing the optimization of our production. Okay. What else does it mean for socialism? Well, it tells us that we see that pull production is literally, we can safe to say something like an order of magnitude better than push production. Okay, so socialism must be a pull production if it is to be the next mode of production, right? Again, this is production. If you think about it at a deep level, production based on demand is production for use. It's not production for profit. Okay, you're not trying to maximize profit and push stuff out, right? You're just producing for use. Okay. And what does it mean for kind of typical notions of central planning? Okay, we're getting into our kind of planning aspect a bit, I suppose. So central planning is like, it's push production taken to a higher recursion, right? Not just push production at the element of the firm, but as the economy as a whole. Okay. So like central planning would be a retrograde step, right? You know, and it just, if we take the concept of requisite variety seriously, the idea of detailed production plans centrally calculated, right, is scientifically illiterate, right? They, people of the higher recursions, they do not have the ability to actually optimize production. It can only be done by those uh, uh, doing the work. And if we take historical materialism seriously, this idea that a mode of production will only change when when it offers the prospects of, unleashing the forces of production we take from feudalism into capitalism, capitalism unleashed the forces of production, the social relations that tied the peasants to their landlords' land, that it got rid of that and it was able to use those in the factories in the cities to massively increase the productivity in the society, right? So if we take that seriously, right, we have to kind of consign this notion of central planning because, this is a 19, it's like a 1920s notion of efficiency. It's been superseded. Okay. You know, there's a deep relationship between alienation, like cooperation and productivity. Only those doing the work have the requisite variety to effectively organize production. As socialists, communists, and anarchists, whatever we want to call ourselves, we should be actually, this is like amazing, right? It's like we want people to have unalienated labor. We want people to have organized and control over their own productive lives. And here we're seeing that the optimal production processes in capitalism actually achieve their highest productivity by actually trying to de-alienate labor. Okay, so this is a very, very strong finding for socialists. I think like this is like an amazing kind of feather in our bow. It's not just that but more so as well. Like it's not just a self-organization of production. Um, it's not just that like we can say that we kind of might have an ethical or a moral want for that. Absolutely. But like from an economic point of view, and I mean like from a historical materialist point of view, right? As socialism as a viable concept, it's much more that like there's a material reason for why self-organization is superior, right? There's material basis for self-organization, right? That should be, I can't overemphasize the importance of this, right? That self-organization is the optimization of production. And capitalism restricts self-organization, uh, you know, because of its class relations. And only a communist or socialist society could undo that. This is a very important thing for socialists, I think, to think about. And if we take planning, the idea of planning seriously, right? We see that like a socialist society or whatever will necessarily be recursive in nature. And each system, as Beer has shown us, planning, there's a system for in every recursion. The planning by scientific law has, by necessity, the necessity of requisite variety, planning has to be done at all recursions. It cannot just be a central plan, right? And so these are very, very deep points, you know. You know, how much we can say, but there's also another point about requisite variety I'd like to make here is like an awful lot of time in socialist planning discourse and stuff like that. People spend a lot of time thinking about, oh, well, what kind of organizational form could we have here and have there? Should we organize it like this or should we organize it like that? Blah, blah, blah. And the thing is, there's very little, like, not that there's very little, there's not that much we can say about the nature of planning in a socialist economy above and beyond the fact that it has to basically not be counter to cybernetic principles, right? And it also has to sit and very fundamentally has to sit within a working socialist political economy, which we're not getting into in this talk. Okay. And I think this emphasis on planning not just central planning, but I think in planning in the general discourse, um, kind of a lot of it rests upon this idea that, there is some technical fix to a social relations problem. Like the problem with the fall of the Soviet Union was oh, they didn't have fast enough computers. If we had faster computers, it would have been grand. And not the fact that the problem was the Soviet Union, that there was wage labor, there was alienated labor, right? And that's the very basis of what a capitalist society is, and wage labor defines that kind of class relation, right? Okay, so so we have to get away from this idea on focusing on the forces production and focus on the social relations of production, right? The technical aspects, organizational forms of coordination and all that, I find myself they seem to be quite uh, secondary in the discourse. The overwhelming. Here's a diagram of the federal government of America. I think yeah, I think just I don't know what year it's from. I just thought it was a cool. Like, we have many books talking about these organizational forms and blah 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 blah, right? But the thing is that the forces won't really solve a relational problem or relations problem, and more fundamentally, these organizational forms, right, they are downstream from the social relations of production. That if we get our social relations of production correct within a socialist society, the organization's forms will be a reflection of that direct production relation. Okay. And so again, I always harp on about this stuff. The focus for us needs to be on, you know, what is the political economy of a socialist, of a socialist society, right? That's the thing we need to really be studying and thinking about. If we go back and you read the Soviet or the Yugoslav or whatever, take your pick. I don't know. I haven't read the Chinese or the Cuban stuff, but I've read a lot of this stuff, right? The planners and the people who are trying to reform and make the system work, they were always primarily concerned with the political economy, right? And they were correct to be concerned with it. Now they never they didn't come up with the right answers, we would argue, right? Obviously things fell apart. So I think, like, we should be focusing as a kind of a group of people interested in, like, a socialist or communist society. We should be focusing on the political economy above and all. Like, capital, Marx's analysis of capital, it's overwhelmingly on the actual social relations of production and their implications, and not, say, forces of production, right? Um, sorry, but force. Let me say, let me precise there. Not on force of production, but more less on the planning, the organizational forms of capitalism. Okay. Now, um, you know, planning for Marx and Engels was always like an implication of what associated, it was like they fundamentally talk about associated labor, and planning was like something that would come out of that, right? So if private when we see Marx and Engels talking about, like, the anarchy of capitalist production, you have one firm knowing only what they're doing. They don't know what the other firm is doing. They buy a new machine, and lo and behold, the other firm has bought a similar machine, and now they've got overproduction, and now they both go bust or something, right? But planning in a socialist society for them was that the workers would be associated, and they could rationally plan their production. They would know we don't need those two machines, right? Because it was not on the basis of private property, but it was on the basis of communal property. Okay, enough of, enough about that. And finally, come back to beer. Now, you know, beer CyberSyn project was amazing, right? I think it's like probably the greatest experiment in socialist, communist, uh, well, we might say, kind of management. Okay, an amazing project, and it deserves a lot of study. Okay, but hammering the point again about the political economy. If you read Beer, well, if you look at the realities of, say, the Chilean experiment, it was basically a kind of a market socialism. Okay, and market socialism had lots of problems that ended up bringing it down. And while CyberSyn may have allowed it may have given it a temporary advantage in certain aspects. It sat upon a political economy that was essentially a capitalist political economy. Okay. And beer was really good at like the organization of production from a production of use value. That was always his emphasis. He thought of these. I remember reading somewhere, I can't remember exactly where, he's talking about money, it's just like a custom, we could get rid of it. Really production is about producing things. We see this in the socialist discourse of people like Hilferding and Neurath back 100 years ago. Very similar discussion. And so while it was an amazing project, it would have failed much like all our other attempts so far. But that does not mean that there is amazing things that we can learn from it. And the thing that comes out of it overwhelmingly for me is that it hammers this point again is what we need to do is we want to meld, right? The insights of the implications of variety and cybernetics with a socialist political economy. And, that is the task that we, Seth and Donal, are trying to do in our book. We are working hard on unifying these into a kind of a coherent uh, world worldview, if you want to say. And so, yeah, that's all I have for you today. Variety is deeply, deeply related to alienation, and alienation to self-organization, and self-organization to optimization of production. We and all of this comes, variety here is a fundamental aspect as socialists. We need to understand it and understand its implications for theorizing on what a socialist society must and should be. Okay, I'll stop it there, everybody. Thanks.